And I think we're good. Maybe a little delayed on the channel, but anyways, thanks JD for coming. Like I don't know. This past week has been crazy. There has been a lot of ICRPG stuff going on, and frankly, I've just been neck deep in it. And I thought it'd be fun to just shoot the breeze, which is why I wanted to talk with you about Root. This was
Yeah.
actually I got like I told you earlier, or in our chats. I got this for Christmas for my birthday. I got like all of the expansions. We found them used, and so my wife
Oh,
got me the whole collection.
score.
So I have been on the side, like knee deep in, well, neck deep in Root. I have it on my phone. It's one of my favorite games. So when I got this, I grabbed it. I started reading through it, and I went to the GM section just to kind of see because I've never actually played a Powered by the Apocalypse game, and
Mm.
a little gem that I wanted to. I sent this to you, and I wanted to talk through it. It's about the priorities of GMing Root, how to like what's first, what are your priorities as you manage it. So I thought it'd be fun to get your thoughts on it as we go through it.
Is there going to be a way for people to see it?
Um, I can highlight little sections here if it's even up in the right direction. I don't know,
Okay.
but I'll have a
Maybe
link
you can
to
link it.
to,
Mm-hmm.
to the book itself in the description after the stream. But
That's okay. I just wanted that reference as we chat, and sounds good to me.
perfect. So before we get going to it, I think like you mentioned before we started, going paragraph by paragraph might be fun. Was there any thoughts you had about it? And then obviously I haven't even started talking about like more in detail, but what did you think about it when I shared it with you?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting to look at, both of us are nails about. And so I look at it through that lens for sure. And so it's cool to see these other little nuggets as we go through. And I think what would be important to say is that we're not necessarily going to be critiquing the quality or like should you go play Root the RPG, but saying, hey, here's another GMing. How can that benefit us as GMs in whatever game that we're playing?
Mm-hmm.
So with the title, wanted that to be clear that it's more about the GM principles and into the nuts and bolts and gritty of like that video that's saying here's all the core rules, here's exactly how all this works, here's and it's very very practical, and sometimes it's fun just to have a philosophical moment and armchair GM and just kind of sit and be like, huh, okay, how does that help or hinder or what have you. And I've got a cup of delicious coffee, and I'm down for it.
Perfect. Yeah, because in all honesty, as we dive into this reminded me of ICRPG's oath, like the GM oath. And as I looked at it, I was like, that's the first thing that came to my mind. This felt like Root GM's oath a little bit, or at least, yeah. Here's your priorities, what you should be focusing on.
Yep.
Your promise to say this is first, this is second, followed, and I think we can go through that. But
sounds good.
Without further ado, let's just talk about kind of what it is. And so the very first part about it is it's under the heading always say, which is it's the idea is to help you resolve which agendas should take precedence at any given moment, or here are the priorities. Like make sure you always say as you're conversing with your players, as you're discussing or what should you be doing, you should say what does the principle the demands and what your prep demands, kind of in that order. So it's that if you have questions or if you're making decisions or as you're playing, be constantly asking yourself these questions and always saying them to yourself or your players. What are the principles? What are the rules? And then going through those.
I think that just to start too, one thing that's an interesting take on this is that um, it's already saying as a GM, you are not the voice of God in the game, and that the GM is bound by you can do this or don't do this. And they actually, as you go through, the language becomes very like cut and dry, black and white, like you don't do that. Which is interesting to see, and part of what kind of caught my attention. But I think that it's interesting to think of. Okay, as a GM, there's a lot of like memes out in the internet. There's a lot of like folk tales of what. If you look at all these articles going on with all the Dungeons and Dragons controversy, they talk about they have to explain to non D&D
Mhm.
people what a dungeon master is, and it's always like that's not really what it is, you know, like that's kind of the worst version of it where it's like they have to do everything and they say what goes. And I like that already from the beginning. It's like, okay, you're still bound by things, you have rules as a GM, and here are these rules to keep in mind that are actually going to benefit the game, because then you have a value set you're going to agree with your players, and that's going to benefit you overall, where it's like, hey, we all agree to this isn't just I'm not just beholden to this, but us as a table, we kind of have some guidelines and expectations. And I like they gave specific language to that. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it felt like it was encouraging GMs to be the what am I trying to say? The patron of consistency. Like as
Mm.
you as you establish your principles or your guidelines of the world of the game, as a GM, you want to be consistent. You want to be
Right.
straightforward. So that at the same time, so that one, you develop trust with your players, because I know for me, if I was playing with somebody and they were always switching things on me and pulling the rug out from under me, I'd feel like I can't trust you. But also, like when you develop that consistency and that trust, you can go, okay, I have a awareness of how this world works, and now I can adjust accordingly. I can plan, I can take actions, and it feels in tune. I feel that way, like with we've been talking a lot about it with like the waste is not kind. Like, what's the tone that we're setting, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks.
Right.
But it has been really good to establish a consistent feel, and that we're on the same page with not only
Yep.
you, GM, or as the players, but that way, as we take actions, it never feels inconsistent and it never feels jarring.
Hmm.
And,
And this is a big difference from video gaming,
mhm,
because you look at video gaming and it's like you're not beholden to these principles because you can only do so much. So it's kind of like almost fun to find how far you can push things. So you look at things like speedrunners, or people that just like, I'm going to use this one weapon for the whole game. And you see things like in like Elder Scrolls games where people game it, but it's because they've been given, they're like, they want to get right up to the edge. And I think it's interesting to think about that in terms of like, that's a huge pet peeve of mine at the table, is when people come to a tabletop RPG with those expectations of like, I want to find that edge and push it and kind of like attempt to break things, where it's like, but it doesn't work because there is no fence. And that's what makes it so magical. But we kind of have to agree, there's nothing that's going to force you to keep these values. And I think that's one thing that's interesting, is like the language kind of puts it like you have to like agree together, okay, we're going to limit ourselves, like we can't just like find every little corner
mhm.
and of exploitation, because that it just doesn't work, because this is living in our heads. So we can find a corner if we really want to. So it's a different kind of vibe, where it's like we're going to restrain ourselves because no outside force is going to restrain us, and for the good of the game.
Yeah, that Pringle can argument, or not the article that Hank put out, like it's like you can eat the Pringles from the Pringle. You're not beholden to any of that stuff. So it's like
Yep.
take what you want from this book. It's not going to tell you how to play, but I do agree. Like there's an element that I really like in that this can help facilitate an experience, and that's what we're all doing. We're at the table
Right.
experience together, however we want to experience it. So no book can tell us what we're experiencing, but it can help us experiencing something magical.
All right.
Perfect. Well, let's dive in to the first one, which is what the principal demands, which I find, again, really interesting that they put this at the top of the list, because it's mentioning that your GM principles are the paths you take to reach your agendas, or it's like how you go about things is your principles as a GM. And so you have to keep those principles in your mind, use them to guide and determine what you say next and what you're aiming for. And then thinking about if you're about to say something that directly contradicts one of your principles, it's a sign that you should rethink that. And I like that they took a very ethereal approach to the first principle is like establish your own personal principles, what the game means, how you want to play, what you're driving towards, and then be consistent with that. Don't contradict yourself. If if my principle for this game is very combat driven or I'm to
Ironically, everything you've been saying has been really clear up to the point we actually dug into this paragraph.
oh
So,
yeah.
am I coming through clearly?
Oh, yeah, you're coming in clearly. Are you talking like audio wise, or are you talking like I've now lost sense and I've now gone into the weeds?
Hmm.
Can you hear me okay?
One moment.
It's all good. While JD's checking on that, is anyone on the chat? Can you guys hear us okay? Or is
It sound.
you sound great?
You sound caught up. It just started garbling, and I was gonna wait it out,
Oh,
and it didn't resolve.
oh,
So I missed what you were saying. I don't feel that you need to repeat everything, um, but I do want to partake in the conversation.
oh. So I sound if I sound okay, um, what I was just saying was that I like that they started with this ethereal approach to establish what me as a GM, my principles are, what the principles of the game are, and encourages that um, that consistency. And it encourages you that if you are trying to establish a tone or an agenda, if you're trying to achieve something, if you're going to say something that contradicts that, rethink it before you do. So I was saying, if I am trying for a very combat driven approach or a game, and I try to say something that pushes it in a different direction, like it's not a bad thing, but as long as I'm not undercutting my agenda, which is combat, then if I am, rethink that and stick to my principles more than anything. And that also goes true with like morals or whatever, but you know, what you're trying for. I know, like for you, both of us really, we like very heroic games. So
Yes.
when we
Hmm.
when we set up adventures, we uh, we shouldn't set up situations where players are going to potentially be non-heroic or whatever, because
Right.
that's not our agenda. That's not what we're driving for. That's not our principles. It's not wrong, but
Right.
that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, you need to think through the repercussions of what you're about to say. Like, is this going to lead or encourage a path that's going to lead into something that is not within the set of principles that we want?
Mm.
Like just give pause and think about that. And maybe not chase every good idea, because that good idea might not fit for this particular campaign, for this particular set of people, etc.
Mhm. Yeah. But what did you think of the first principle or the first kind of paragraph about it?
Yeah, this one is a little bit harder in terms of it being universal because it refers specifically to some of the principles of this particular RPG for it to work. And I think that what I would take from of what the principles demand is, I think as a GM, it's helpful to be direct and to, we provide that service of giving the boundaries. I think that that's kind of a service the GM provides. It's not, it doesn't make us referees in terms of like we blow the whistle all the time, but it helps actually provide the context of like, just like we describe what the situation looks like, we need to describe what the tone looks like. And so that's kind of what I've taken from it is like actually defining principles. I think could be a really cool way of saying that, of like when I'm starting a new like I'm just booting up a new campaign with some folks, and I'm really excited about it. And also, I've played with them before, so there's less of this work. But it's kind of important for me to say, and to like from the beginning say like, I'm not really comfortable with that, or oh, I would like it to actually be like, can we maneuver this a little bit so that we keep in line with the tone. And the really cool thing to see is I played a campaign with the same group. Now we're starting a new one. And the really cool part of that is like we're starting text RP in this new campaign, and it is like right on point. Like all of us are on the same page in such a really cool way because we took that time to develop and say, this is a little bit out of bounds, or this is like what I want. Can we customize that? Absolutely, that exists now. So kind of that negotiation where once you actually get these principles in place, your players will also start to like they have a responsibility to maintain that as well. And when everybody starts agreeing on those principles, it actually is really, really cool, the momentum that can be gained. I'm excited to play. Like Drew, who's in the chat, is like in our game, and I'm super excited to play with the same people again because I don't have to like reinforce principles or rediscover unspoken principles. They can be there, and we can work off of that. And now there's a lot of additional room that we can take because we're going to trust each other. We're going to be like, okay, I know we're on the same page, so now we can explore and have some more creative freedom. So I think that actually defining those boundaries, agreeing to those, will result later in like, oh, actually you can kind of like start playing with them a little bit in a fun way.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I have to say, the RP chat, I've been able to just kind of tune into it. It is on point. 100% agree. How you've set up that campaign just makes me so excited. And Victor Ezerhard is actually asking a question.
Victor?
And I think I'm really glad that you're asking JD this because he's an absolute pro at establishing tone. But he's asking, what is you use, JD, to define the tone? Is
yep.
that a process that you could suggest that we all follow?
So with that, because I've been thinking about this, because we've been chatting a lot about tone, and I'm really neck deep into post-apocalyptic, and most post-apocalyptic tone I don't like. Like it's not something I'm interested in. It's kind of like nihilistic. It's kind of grimy. Like everybody's gray morally, and I think that there's interesting stories to tell, but I don't want to live in that space. Like that's not exciting. So I've really challenged myself to have a tone that I'm excited about, and part of that is heroic. And part of that is just saying you can have flawed characters, but let's be heroes. When push comes to shove, we're going to be people that are good in heart to be able to follow through and do the right thing. So there's that of just like me as a GM, I have to say like this is what I like, and I need a group that can go along with that. If I'm constantly fighting that with a group, you're always going to struggle with the tone. The other thing is mechanics. So you can have mechanics that help enforce that. I've developed some mechanics that help enforce if people start going into like a nihilistic route, or they do something that's kind of murder hobo like in the RPG sphere. I have mechanics that can kind of like, I don't just straight up punish them of like, no, you can't do that, and now the town guards kill you. But I have mechanics that help enforce like, that was a so one thing was a game you played in. There was a monster and a mercenary that were bad guys, and you guys ran past them and closed the door on the mercenary as they like looked through the little window, and the monster was coming up. And I said, that's like make a save, or you gain adrenaline, you gain this thing that kind of becomes a burden. Like you can't just keep making these inhumane choices. So mechanics do it, and then having a touchstone. So I think we have those with fantasy and sci-fi of like, I want it to be like this. So saying I want a Aliens Invaders game to be more like Falling Skies will be really different from I want Alien Invader game to feel like 80s Red Dawn. Like those are really different tones. But if everybody can kind of like have a little bit of pop culture of like, oh, okay, so that wouldn't make sense in this part of media, that can be really helpful. So when I made a post-apocalyptic, I love Mad Max Fury Road because it's not overly dark. There's like bright moments and redemption and literally brighter colors than most post-apocalyptic shows. And so, yeah. So having a touchstone, agreeing with like the group and negotiating with the group what that tone is going to be, and having something you feel settled in. I don't want to feel unsettled the whole time I'm playing, or I'm like, I'm not really, this feels weird to me. And then having mechanics. So those kind of different things have helped steer the course, where you can have a tone that's enjoyable and making intentional decisions for each of those things. So that to follow that rabbit trail, I don't know about a method or process, but those are the things that I've been thoughtful about in order to help the tone be what it is.
Well, and what I would say to it, the only other thing that I would add to that, because I 100% agree, and I think you nail each one of those as you've worked through it, is that JD has made a concerted effort to be very open with us as players about those things. He tells us what his desires are as a GM, what tone he's going for. He listens when we say this, what tones we're thinking of, or what we think is cool, which is great. He explains that this mechanic is used to enforce that tone. It's not a
right.
Like, you are very open with why you're making those decisions with us, so that we can understand. And then you are very vocal about like how this thing that inspired you to do this leads into the game and what you're hoping to get out of it. Not in a way to force us to do it, but you're sharing your passion, and it's infectious. And so I would say that is the other thing you need to be, is if you're going to establish a tone, you need to be vocal and honest with your players.
And this is a big thing I learned from Runehammer. It like ethos and ICRPG ethos is like, be transparent. Don't try to like sneak things. Like the only times I've ever tried to be sneaky is for like very minor things to kind of have a little bit of a moment of a reveal. But as far as like mechanics, as far as like what I'm thinking, I think some of the best advice I got was like, players actually don't, it's not as clear as you think it is when you say something. So you might say something that's like flavorful and be like, this is the NPC describing this, and then take a step back, and as a GM being like, what he means is you have choice A or choice B. And so doing that as well with tone, with mechanics, with expectations, you just got to say them. You got to be direct about them, because if you try to like sneak a mechanic in there that's going to like start punishing people and they don't know what's happening, that's going to create a really kind of toxic thing. And looking at Oracle's example of this character sheet and chart, that's a great example of a mechanic that informs tone. So that mechanic lets you become evil, and so there's an expectation just by having that on the page. Hey, it's okay if you become evil. That will be like a way of character death. But I find it really interesting, because it opens the door where it's like, immediately as a player, I'm like, oh, so I can make evil choices. Whereas if you didn't have that mechanic and you just removed that and said, let's be heroes in like a dark world, then all of a sudden that door isn't opened. And like, if you had a player be like, I want to be evil, you can negotiate it, but it's not like, it's almost encouraged by just suggesting like, oh, there's a morality track. And so like thinking through, what are those repercussions of tone in those mechanics? And if that's like I know a lot of Professor DM's tone is, he likes grimdark, he likes gritty, like gray morality. So that mechanic is perfect for what he's going for, because you can have that actually played out where it's like, oh, I'm seeing this progression toward evil, perfect for what he wants. I would be frustrated with that, of like, no, don't make evil choices. Like and if you want to go do that, have a group that does and enjoys it, and you have great time together. I don't like that as much. So then what can we do about that as a group, and find something that we're both enjoyable.
Yeah. I have all of that because you establish principles and you're consistent with them.
Yep. Absolutely.
Coming to bringing it back. Again, thanks for everybody for coming and stopping by as well. So,
yep.
On. But we've established those principles. I do agree. Those are the first and foremost. And like we've just seen, it sets up the foundation of so much of our game. But then afterwards, what Root pointed out was the second priority to the list is what the rules demand. Okay, so the rules always require interpretation. It calls it out. Like they're not set in stone because JD's right. You can choose to ignore. Um, you can choose to ignore anything in the book. You're not beholden. But once you've interpreted them, like exactly how the wording is translated in a particular fiction, like you interpret that. But once you say it, whatever you say sits in accord with the rule. As a GM, like you say it, it is rules. You know, it is you've established that. Even if you've kind of interpreted it in your own way for that moment. If the rules say that a character, I'm just reading it out now. If the rules say that
Yep.
a character suffers injury, like if a character gets hurt, the dice decide that happens. If the rules say the character's treasured piece of equipment breaks, it breaks. If a character reaches the end of the line of the sword of an enemy, that's the end. This is very much like don't fudge things. Don't, you've established a rule, whatever the rule may be, your players need that consistency to
Yep.
trust the game and to go there. And you as a GM need to be bold enough to stick with it. Because as soon as you start getting wishy-washy, the game starts feeling wishy-washy. At least for me.
Yeah.
It's a lot like if your player dies and you've kind of been in it played out, you know, luck was not on your side today, your character is gone. It's way harder if up to that point.
So this reminds me of my biggest level up moment as a GM, and that was that Vigilante City game with you and Lon, and that is burned in my brain not only because of the fire in the game, but it burned in my brain because I wanted tension I was running the game. I wanted tension, but I wanted heroics. I wanted there to be this happy ending, and I think that what I realized and what Lon gave me as like my best advice ever was basically don't pull punches and give players things before the moment of tension if you really want to see those heroic moments. So what happened was we ended up in the space where the dice got real cold and there was a nasty bad guy, and that nasty bad guy was working its way toward a bus of the only survivors of this town and was going to nuke that bus with it was a Hellion dragon from ICRPG, and they were superheroes fighting, but they could like the dice just would not work for you guys. And I started sweating as a GM because if the dice went a different way, you could have roasted this thing, but they didn't. And this thing was like working its way toward this bus, the survivors. The whole point was to like save these people. And and like the way the dice fell, I ended up trying to give hero coins in the moment of like, Lon had a bad roll. I was like, you know what, like take a hero coin. And it took the breath out of the game because the dice fell a certain way. This is what happened. And I interjected and narratively said, no, that's not what happens. You get a hero coin. And I didn't mean it that way. It was like in hindsight that I saw it, but it really affected the game in a negative way where it still didn't help because the dice were still cold. That dragon went over to the bus, rolled like a crit, and roasted the entire bus. And that was like the end of the session. Was like, you guys failed. Like the city is destroyed. The last survivors are dead. There's a demonic dragon that is now unleashed, and it succeeded. It did everything it was supposed to. And like, if that had just been the honest result, that would have been a great memory. But the fact that like I tried to fudge it, and I used fudge. I didn't like change the numbers. I just tried to help you guys out. I think that's what I'm thinking about. Where what the rules demand is, you have to be aware that if you have like meta currency like hero coins, if you have points that you spend and do this kind of stuff, if in the moment you as a GM are trying to achieve a moment on a player's turn and the rules don't allow for that and you're kind of like working with it, just beware. Because you need to let those rules exist for a reason, and that's where the consistency breaks. It's where the principles break down, and all of a sudden you have like this kind of muddy atmosphere of like, what do I like? What's actually happening? And that's where a GM like just has to be really careful. To be rewritten in the moment. I agree. You can't, go back on a previous ruling and all that. And at the same time, what I would have done at that moment was stop and be like, guys, I'm pretty bummed. Like, this is not how I saw this going. And I should have had that transparency from like a human to a human instead of trying to like fiddle about in the narrative. You know, like I could have expressed that as a person, like JD sitting in GM chair going like, I don't like this. Like, what do we do? You know? But instead I tried to like kind of game it. And I think that's where the rules need to be the rules. And then this is where I kind of disagree is like it can start to form this rigidity where you're kind of like, well, guys, like, sorry, we're all bummed, but that's what the rules say. But I think that there can be a division between this is the rules, we agree to these, we're letting the dice fall, but us as players, let's talk about it because we're bummed right now and like things didn't go well, and you can kind of have that human conversation while still keeping the consistency of the game. So I spiral. I worked around that point for a while. That's what I was trying to say.
Because I agree. Like, I don't want to develop that rigidity where we go, you done did the dice did it, you died. Sorry, there was nothing you could do. A tribunal is absolutely a good option to talk through it.
Yep.
But I also think like this is why I like how they word it in Root. It says, "What do the rules demand?" Well, the rules don't demand obedience, but the demand is consistency.
That's a good point.
They just demand consistency, and I know for me, like from my experience, it's been more about like you experienced this kind of letdown on what was happening to the players. I feel that letdown quite often with on the GM side. My I have a game where I have this big Arden witch that's this super evil witch, and
Totally.
Shucks. By the rules, they played it well, and she's dead.
Yep.
Through the fall of Arnor the last week, and in one round, shucks, Imperator Rax is down by the rules, and
Yep.
I have to resist that urge to fiddle because the rules demand a consistency. But I like if I feel bummed about it, I can talk and have a tribunal afterwards and say, hey, my bosses are kind of getting wiped. What do I need to do to challenge you guys? What do I need to do to improve? Do I need to do I need to up the damage dice? Do I need to be more threatening? Like, and I can work that out afterwards.
And that's a real benefit to have with having you as a player. You're a very experienced GM. You know what that feels like, and so a conversation, if you're a player, can go really well. Of like, and that's a benefit to like playing with people that also run games. Is like they understand. Oh yeah, totally, I get that, and then they'll have their own ideas. And I think that what we're saying here too is like you need to be sure you're having fun. These games are for fun. And if the rules are just demanding and putting you in the space where you're bummed out all the time, what can we figure out to where we'll stay consistent, but what needs to change? How can you continue to have fun and trying to keep both of those things in balance, and like don't just start changing the rules because you're not having fun in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, Chris, you did all die. That was kind of the point of Fallen Arnor. You succeeded. Very happy about that. But yeah, it's like Imperator Rax comes in. He's the big bad. It's like, whoop. This happens, but it's okay. Yeah. It's okay. It's the memories that happen.
It's all about what are those rules trying to accomplish? What is the goal here? And what Chris is saying there about the GM having emotions. It's like, remember that this is a arena of play. This is an arena of imagination and fun, and we only have these rules in order to we only have these rules in order to facilitate that fun. And so keeping those things in mind, where it's like it's not the rules for the sake of rules, it's rules for the sake of fun. And I will keep in mind about my audio overwriting, so work on that.
JD has his nice headphones, and I'm literally talking into the phone that's also the speaker, and so we will try to pass the buck a little bit as we talk, not over each other. But yeah. All right, so here's the next one, and this is we've kind of danced around this one already. And the next one is what honesty demands. And I love how our Root is putting this as very they're touching on the emotions and like the experience of playing RPG. So what it says is honesty is your job as a GM is never to deceive the players or their characters outright. When you represent the world, represent it honestly. If there's something the characters would notice, tell them. If there's something they would know, they ask about it, tell them. You can use in the case that help the players what a player might. You can use as your GM your knowledge to kind of facilitate those things without just kind of like, oh yeah, by the way, you guys, there's a secret door over here in the corner. Like you can kind of clue them in a little bit and let them experience it without just like the last thing you want is to be like playing the game for them, but you can facilitate. Uh, and JD mentioned this earlier. Like players don't feel the drama because you pulled the wool over their eyes. There's so many better ways to get them to feel drama than to keep something hidden and go, I got you. It's like no, it doesn't ever land the way that you think it was going to land, and that's why I think it's really be honest as GMs. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that you're always working with limited information, just visually. The amount of words that are spoken, tabletop RPGs are just limited in the amount of like your imagination is so strong, but you only are getting what's provided. And if that's like 3D terrain, on a tabletop, that's probably going to be one of the most robust versions of like information that you can gain.
Mhm.
But even like I'm constantly tweaking, like don't look at that part of my VTT map because that actually is not there. So you have to provide enough information, and I think that clarity of information is another way of saying like the honesty, like have clarity. Um, to where you're not hiding anything, and if they would notice something, tell them. So like you have to tell them there's that thing in the corner and that's what that thing is, because I don't know if it's maybe my style or what, but I haven't experienced players asking a lot of questions about like, oh, what's here, what is that thing. And I see that in a lot of like OSR games and stuff, and I don't know exactly what the difference is of just kind of like table culture of what you're used to, like the feedback loop with a GM. But I have to typically like and I'm not saying this is a complaint at all, I just typically have to provide a lot of information, and I forget that because then when I'm doing prep, I'm like, it's all there. I can see it. I can see it 100%. And so I think that um, providing, like, realizing they don't see what's in your head, they can't read your mind, and so being very careful with hiding anything and like have it be a really specific purpose. I'm curious your thoughts on, is there a place for gotcha moments, and where does that actually work, where have you seen it work, because it's a tricky one to pull off, and it can feel pretty like, well, okay, like kind of
Uh,
anticlimactic.
well, I'm going to use the example that I gave in my conversation with Brock over on Dungeon Masters Toolkit, and it's the idea of getting a friend who's afraid of clowns into a haunted house, right? So the fun, if you have a friend who is afraid of clowns and you're going to a haunted house, the fun part is not telling your friends that there's clowns in the haunted house. Like that's you're hiding information and you're hoping that the big reveal that there's clowns in this haunted house is going to be sufficient for he whatever. Um, the fun part, and I'm a terrible human being for this, is telling your friend that there's clowns in the haunted house and then doing everything in your power to get them in front of a clown at the haunted house. Right? So in our games, a gotcha moment doesn't come from hidden information. It comes from the drama and stress that this could potentially happen, or that this is available and that this is coming, or that this is right around the corner. What are you going to do about it? What I'm trying to think of there was one particular game, I can't remember exactly which one. Um, I think it was the the Black Castle game, where I would drop the word like dread, dread. Like you have an overwhelming feeling of dread, and that was a consistency that I developed with players that I was playing over off marches. When I would drop the word dread, they knew something was coming. They knew that this I had something in my back pocket, but I wasn't like hiding it from them. I would describe what they were feeling. I would explain it, and then I would kind of position them, and then they would try to mitigate it, and then the thing would happen, and they would be better or not. Um, Victor's right. Timers. These are great gotchas where it's like I roll a die. Everyone knows that in 2 rounds something is going to happen. Um, and that's a great gotcha moment because they don't know what is going to happen on the other timer, but I didn't pull the wool over their eyes by keeping that hidden and just springing it on them. So that's kind of what I would say is I think like it says in Root, it says there are plenty of other ways to create that drama, and there really are. So gotchas are perfect. Just don't do it by deceitful ways.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is anticipation is typically better than the reveal. And there's a lot of human psychology to this too. Like we typically anticipating things, we actually get a lot more out of that than the actual moment. Like that's part of the enjoyment of a thing. And I think that maybe that's a good way to surmise like the honesty part of it. And I still like an occasional like you did not see this coming. I just try to keep that where it's like it doesn't derail
Mhm.
it doesn't derail the consistency, it doesn't derail the principles, it doesn't derail like our trust. And it's almost like I have like a trust capital I build up, and then it's like okay, but like I every once in a while as a GM I get these moments where I get to spring something on you, and now the outcome and those consequences are going to be fun drama for us to like figure out. But I agree that often it's not as much fun as we think it's going to be as game masters.
I don't want my players to not to distrust me to the point where they need a 10-foot pole poking at every stone because every single time I describe a corridor in the dungeon that there's going to be a trapdoor or
Yeah.
so.
Another thing I would say is um, pull that band-aid quickly if you're going to do like a reveal, is like get it out there and let those consequences be the fun drama,
Mhm.
and don't just like hold it over like okay here we go. I feel like one that worked well for me was they were on a spaceship crew. It was like the opening of a session, and a pirate ship was coming into the to deal with their ship, and they've been dealing with the android enemies. And at the start of a session, a guy, or actually it was a few turns in, they started exploring the ship, and once they like separated and this guy got one of them alone, he just shot them point blank. Now I left it up to the dice to say, this traitorous action happened, but I'm going to roll effort to see does he actually take you out or just wound you. And it kind of left this like moment of like, I'm not just going to say, oh, you're dead.
Yeah.
But that like, and I don't try to do that all that often, but it was like, okay, enemies revealed itself, so now there's a new situation that you need to deal with. And again, I try to do those very sparingly because like they take a lot of they withdraw from that trust capital a little bit, but I do think it's still a tool that you can play with as a GM. It's
Yeah.
not like off limits.
No, I agree. In the castle, well, I apparently did a lot of things in the Black Castle game that we're talking about. I did that where we had a timer, and I said, "Hey, you have this feeling of dread as they're exploring this library. They were doing their thing, and all of a sudden the timer hit, and I just cut the scene, fade to black. They are now in a dream state in these various places, and there was no option for them to do anything. And we had a little bit of a tribunal afterwards, and you could tell the drawn trust a little bit from a few of the players that I had done something that lost a little bit of trust from them, but we were able to talk through it and said, like I did have a timer. I was giving you warning. I completely agree where you're coming from. So I don't do that every time, but yeah, I saw that happen, and so we have to be careful, but it can be done. Well, do you want to read out the last one?
Will do.
Thank you.
So this one is what your prep demands. and you will prepare some things in advance. You might write up a clearing, getting across its general issues and major denizens, which is specific to this game.
Yeah.
You might write a custom move to handle a specific situation. You might predefine the harm tracks of a few important NPCs. Stick to that prep. If you give an NPC 2 boxes of injury because it felt right in prep, don't inflate it suddenly because the PCs steamrolled them. Similarly, if you give an NPC 5 boxes of injury, don't deflate it because they're having trouble. You designed that NPC to be terrifyingly powerful, and they should be.
Yeah. The fact that they put this at the bottom is telling, because like if you got the first 3 in order, now you're actually into the point of what you've done in the prep and what you're actually running, what you've set up for the players to experience. But it is that one where it's where do you draw the line on fudging, or where do you draw the line on tweaking or adjusting to the rule of cool lives in this space, in my opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you've prepped a baddie like you did the Hellion. You've prepped a baddie to be a certain way, and you designed him to be terrifying, but things happen in the game. The prep that you've done is they're saying, what does it exactly demand? And so does it contradict your principles by tweaking it? Does it not? How do you play things out? And so like this is I think it really does, once you get the thirst in line, you kind of have a feeling for what does your prep demand of you, how beholden are wrong. I'm very prepared for a conversation with Chris coming up next week about math, and how that if you're not aware of the math of the game, you can prep a thing to be a total TPK killer. Like you can set your players up to die, and if you stick to that prep, you're going to kill your players. Is that right or wrong? Up to you to decide. But you can't, if you're not prepping carefully and you stick to it, then you could make a bad experience for the players. So now it's like, what does it demand? In my opinion, your prep demands that you trust what you did, and then you learn from it afterwards, more than trying to fiddle in the game. Like you said earlier, you can pause and say, hey, you know what, guys? Like, I prepped something that I'm not feeling anymore. Like, how can we talk through this? Right? Yeah. That's what I think prep demands.
I think that what this is not saying is don't feel like, I wouldn't want anyone to feel trapped if things change from their prep.
Mm-hmm.
Because when does that not happen? Like, when are you not on your toes of like, they ask about a thing and you didn't write anything? The great example I'm thinking of here was you can watch it on your channel, was the finale of the Crater to Grave arc that we ran. And Drew, who's in the chat, decided to poke around with this thing called a mainframe, and I had literally just grabbed art from my collection of art to populate this interesting looking secret lab. And I did not expect it to be anything at all. But sure enough, he pops the lid off of the containment and pulls this thing out. And suddenly I'm like, this is where consistency and principles have to matter. I guess I could have, as a GM, let that fall flat. And this is a good example of like, if I wanted to stick to I wanted things to stay on track. And this is what I encourage you not to do, is like, he pulls that thing out of the jar and you just go, it's a cube, it's inert, and you hold the thing and it kind of buzzes and whirs, but nothing happens. I could have done that, and I could have just like, you've made a choice to spend your time doing something worthless. But I think that Drew knew I wouldn't let that happen. I think that he picked that up knowing like, what is going to happen, like, what am I going to trigger? And it ended up being such a fun new element, and I had no notes on that. I just had to like, I literally stood up during the game, went and got my book, and like opened up to the mainframe and started having to do things the mainframe would do. And it ended up being my favorite part of that whole session. So I think it's like talking about what your prep demands is, don't be careful that you don't feel like rigid, tied, like, oh no, we're changing things, and so I need to get us back on track to the prep. I think that this point simply goes back, and honestly, they probably could have just said the honesty paragraph and covered all of these points, because that's what we're talking about here. Is like, don't fudge things. We're talking about fudging. We're talking about changing things because in the moment you think that that's not. You need to be consistent. You need to provide that atmosphere for your players, and be really, really careful whenever you kind of tweak that in any other way. And I love that you're saying a really practical point is talk about it after, even, like follow through and be like, oof, learn my lesson and talk about it after. But also be willing to, like, I think the magic of tabletop role playing games and what cannot be defined, and the magic of it is that, in that game we had multiple creative minds all contributing to the story, one after the other, and you got to keep up as a GM, because if you don't chase any of those like rabbit trails, you're going to miss out on some of the most fun you're ever going to have, because video games don't allow that. That's why I'm just not that interested in video games anymore. I play a little bit with my family, but I just like get to the thing. I'm like, well, I can press A or I can press B, and that skill set that developing skill doesn't matter to me in a game. What matters to me in a game is, can I pop the lid off and unleash a mainframe and see what happens. Like that was so fun. So I guess that's what's on my mind looking at this, of like, the way this is written, it says what's demanded, and I would hate for like a new GM or somebody that didn't feel. I mean, all GMs feel a little bit of trouble with self-confidence. I think that's just as a plague among people running games, is they don't want to, like, there's probably a few really big jerks out there that just steamroll, but I think most of us are pretty concerned that we're being too harsh, or we're being the voice of God when we shouldn't be, or whatever. And I think that all of these principles are coming back to, like, I wouldn't want anyone to feel like bound of like, I can't chase this fun idea, or we can't go off the rails. It's just be consistent, be transparent, like, have fun, and that will give you the freedom to start chasing new things because you keep these kind of foundational principles in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, with the prep, I think what it really demands is that you use prep to support yourself as a GM. Like it's an aid. It's your safety net as a GM, as you're running your friends through this experience. Like it's not not a constricting net. It's not meant to tie you down, but to enable you to walk a line, to experience something, to test new things out, learn from it, and then go back and try again. And so that's I always feel better having a little bit of my prep right there next to me when I'm going. But yeah, there's a lot of times, like you did so well with the mainframe, is something happens and I have to make a little note on the side and try to be consistent and try to stick with my principles there, to react to what the players are doing, because we're going somewhere together, and that's the fun we're having. But I couldn't see that coming when I was writing in my journal, or what I did.
I think that good prep actually allows you to go into new things. And I think that everything we're talking about is, if you have consistency in these other areas, you have solid prep that you feel good about. What that's doing more than anything, and this is a big thing that Hankrin talks about with ICRPG, is like, you can do prep and then put your journal away and not use it in terms of like going point by point. The prep actually just lets you have mastery of that environment and that concept, where you feel confident, like if somebody says, is this there, you can answer to some degree because you have a mastery of that situation. And I think that that's where you need consistency, where it's like reality is not just changing turn to turn. And I think that, like, in that session, I had prep that I felt good about, and it allowed me the freedom to say, I feel confident enough in the mastery of the situation that I can introduce something new to that same situation and have that play out in a way that feels good.
Mm-hmm.
if I didn't have the prep and I felt like I needed to change things moment to moment, I would actually I would actually feel less confident to like I'd be sweating more to say like, okay, I guess now there's a mainframe and now I need to like run with that because I didn't feel like I had mastery of the rest of the situation. So it's I think that's, as we're talking about it, verbally processing, that's a lot of what comes to mind for me is like you have the consistency, you agree with the table what you're looking for, you have trust, you have honesty in place, then you can start adding in this kind of magic ingredient, this special sauce of the unexpected, and it's not going to derail things. It's not going to derail the fun. It might derail a specific thing you thought was going to happen, but it's not going to derail the narrative.
Exactly. And I mean, we play this game to have fun, and so whether you're following the ICRPG oath, whether you're following these principles presented in Root, or whatever else you find in other games, I mean, like, no matter what we're doing, we're having fun, and that's the ultimate goal. Is we gather around the table, roll some dice with friends who also enjoy telling these stories together. And every piece of advice in every book is always trying, hopefully, to enable us to have more fun than at home and go to a meeting on my computer in 5 minutes.
Right. I think that what Drew is saying of prep from prior sessions. This a quick plug for, I think both of us are really on board with the idea of prep one session at a time. Mm-hmm. And if I had not prepped one session at a time, I think that some of the magic moments in that campaign wouldn't have happened, because I didn't expect that NPC that he's referring to be such a highlight and such a like moment that stood out in your minds. Like, I thought it'd be kind of a fun moment, move on. But having one session at a time allowed me to like, oh, I'm going to fold that character back in because that was a lot of fun. And I'm going to have this chance to like circle back around, where I feel like it would be where if you're prepped, if saying what your prep demands means I've prepared this campaign and we need to follow this through, or there's this module, we need to follow it through step by step. Again, you have to agree, you have to have the consistency, you have to have players on board, but you miss out on, oh, you know what? Players really latched onto that. That was really cool. I'm going to bring that back. And I love bringing things back, but doing one session at a time really helps that. It also frees where you can negotiate things a little bit, because you're not worried about, well, what about 3 sessions from now where I thought we were going and now we're going a different direction. You only have to really have mastery of that one session.
Yeah. And you can get the satisfaction and not control, but you can establish the tone of what you're going for this one session, and then have an opportunity, an honest break with your players to say, okay, what's next? You've given yourself an opportunity to read and negotiate, to reestablish, just rather than pinning yourself down in one direction for the next 5 sessions that may or may not work out.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun. I've greatly appreciated this conversation. And again, like, I haven't played Root. This is just something that I picked up as I was reading through it. But look what can come from just talking about things. And so thank you, JD, for being willing to talk ethereal philosophy armchair with me about this stuff. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I really enjoy I like the craft of being a game master, and I think it's one of those things that it's not that difficult to actually just do it and get started. But I think one of the reasons I keep coming back is it's one of those things you can continually get better at, and that's what makes it such a great hobby. Is like you can just get fine tune these things and get better and better at what's happening. And I really haven't been a GM that long, in terms of most of the people I hear are doing this for decades, and I really enjoy getting to like talk through these things. And what I'm pulling away is like, yeah, it's all about that consistency. It's about transparency. It's about having mastery of a foundation and then building on that foundation. The last little thing I think about is I heard about this experiment. I can't reference or cite the exact thing, but basically they did this experiment with little kids on a playground, and they said, okay, we're going to remove all fences from the play space, the yard, the playground, and they had kids go out at school and they played on the playground. And when there were no fences, they like tracked the movement of the kids on the playground, and all the kids stayed really close to the center. But when they put up fences, they found that kids would go all the way up to the fence. And there was a lot more room to explore and a lot more room to play. And this is probably just a personality thing because I like structure. I like when things are like clearly defined. And that's probably why I like tabletop RPGs so much. But something in that really feels pertinent to being a game master is if you're just like there's no consistency, there's no walls, there's no fences, like I think what's going to end up happening is like people don't feel safe to kind of explore role playing, to explore moving forward with their character, to like try something new, to introduce a new concept. But I think if you establish those principles, if you have the honesty and the trust, and you say this is actually the boundaries, and you can provide that service to players, I think that you're going to find them exploring more, and you're going to find more satisfying times because you all feel like, yeah, you can go over there, that's fine, because there's a fence, we don't go past that, we agree on that. And it's a whole different conversation of like, what about the kids that climb the fence, like that's a whole different thing. But I just like that. I like that mental picture of like having these things in place and beholding yourself to a few rules. I think actually gives more room to explore in a way, and you'll have some more satisfying moments.
Well, they do say that constraints tend to breed more creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it's not impossible in a freeform space, but I think it really can just open up a ton of opportunities and get better. So, 'tis the dream. Keep working. Keep going at it.
Oh yeah.
I like what Victor said. I just want to have a call out. Being a GM is the GM is a blade that needs constant sharpening. That's what we're doing here.
Oh yeah.
Just constant sharpening. So thank you, Victor, for calling out. Thanks everybody for coming. I gotta go to a meeting.
Oh yeah.
Not that I want to, but gotta go to a meeting. Tis,
All
tis.
right.
So JD, thank you. Thanks everybody. We'll chat again and we'll see you on the internet.
Sounds good. Had fun.
Thanks. I can. I don't know how to turn this off. There we go.